Hi there. My name is Michael Smith, and I'm an independent cybersecurity consultant operating under the company name Rising Tide Cybersecurity Management. One of the services that I have is to help small companies, startups usually, build the right size security program based on, how big they are, what their maturity level is, and that scales with them as they grow as a company. Business wise, I have three core services or service areas that I offer. The first one is for cybersecurity startups, cybersecurity vendors. I function as a CTO, helping them with building good product, technical insights, light focus on PR, AR, so public relations, account analyst relations, a little bit of security pre-sales, but mostly on the product space. The second service that I offer is advisory at a global level. So things like countrywide malware protection, countrywide DDoS response, incident response across the internet for large issues, large sporting events, elections, things like that. And then the third service that I have is serving as a virtual Chief Information Security Officer or CISO for startups and small, medium-sized businesses. Now, don't let the tie fool you. I actually have a pretty good tech background. During the .com era, I did a lot of Linux system administration, building Linux systems, and then programming a lot of shopping carts and other web applications using LAMP stack, so Linux, Apache, PHP, MySQL. Today, I still do a lot of programming, usually focused on data aggregation and analysis, or systems administration and automation. In my mind, I've got this picture, and it's these three core pieces of cybersecurity, and then I overlay them over the top of a startup. And you have to understand, these are three distinct fields or disciplines for cybersecurity. Enterprise security is the common security for large organizations that we usually deal with, and that's how the industry is structured, is around supporting the enterprise. Then there's startups. Startups, your goal is to have what we call a minimally viable product, but an MVP for a security program. And then over time, as your company grows, as your product grows, to have the right size of security program that grows with that. And then there's another discipline that's for product and device security. That is building a product. So whether it's a website, whether it's a firmware device, whether it's a piece of desktop software, whether it's something that's not IT related whatsoever, but to build security for that particular product or device or service or whatever you have, but to build that in a secure manner so that your customers are protected. A majority of the companies that I work with don't have a full-time security person or even somebody that has a side job of doing some kind of security role. There are a couple of reasons for why that happens. I think the biggest one is that as a startup, you run into this kind of uncanny gap, which is if we had more income, more revenue, more product, we could make more money to hire engineers, hire security staff, hire sales and marketing people. And yet, on the other hand, if you have more engineers, more product people, more development on your product, you can get more income and you have something to sell. So you're really trying to ratchet both of these up at the same time. And it's a lot of push and pull between these two different poles. Now, the interesting thing for me and really why I'm attracted to this space at all is that you're really trying to deal with this challenge of having that right size security program, fulfilling your customers' requirements, and yet at the same time, actually having resources to build a product. The most interesting thing that I've thought about for quite a while in the difference between enterprise security and startup security is that on the enterprise security side, you start out with a framework. So you say, pick one. You want, You want COBIT, which is a big set of controls. You want NIST, risk management framework or cybersecurity framework. You want PCI DSS. You want one of these frameworks, and then everything in that catalog of controls is included by default. Okay, so things like email security, security policy, security operations, all of these things, because those catalogs are a list of how an incident happened, right? So the way things like this work is you go out and you look at incidents that have happened and what things could have prevented those incidents, and you put those and add those into the catalog. So here we are, decades later, we've got this catalog of all the ways that attacks could happen to an organization. That's what the enterprise folks start with, usually driven by compliance, usually driven by customer demand. On the startup side, what you're looking for is creating things by inclusion. So you start with 0, and then as things make sense to you, you start to incorporate those in. Where on the enterprise side, everything's included, and then you go in and remove things from your security program if they don't apply to your program. Okay. A classic example of this is where you might have something like web application security. Well, if you're a large enterprise, you probably have web applications and they probably need some kind of security support. On the startup side, you might not have a web application, right? You might have a simple web presence that's a brochure type website. It's 5 pages, who we are, our founder story, what our products are. And there's not a lot of interactivity. You don't need a lot of web security for that. Another thing to consider on the startup side is that you rely a lot on service providers, right? So you might not go install your own email server and your own web server cluster and even your own customer relationship management software. You get those in a SaaS version. And in doing so, you release yourself from a lot of the burden of having to do systems administration, systems hardening, but then you become more reliant on whoever that service provider is, right? Whether it's maybe you're using an enterprise Gmail or Office 365 for your email. Maybe you're using HubSpot or Salesforce for your CRM, but you're really dependent on those service providers. So you take all those away and you look at what's left. What are the things that we actually do and what things need to be secured? Out of that, I have a mental model on what's the right size of security for the right size of company. Now, don't get too hung up on the numbers of exact employees. That's just a swag figure, right? It's just a wild ass guess. And it really just gives you an idea of what other things that people of a company that size are working on. Once I get through these, I'll tell you the things that you can do that would actually increase the amount of security program that you need. Okay. So for 10 employees, you don't have a lot of stuff, right? You need email security, which I think is just anybody needs email security. And by that, I mean 2 things. One is just regular spam filtering. Get rid of the junk so you can spend more time working on things that matter. The second thing is anti-phishing for just everybody in your company, but looking at things like service providers. So say where you use cloud services or SaaS services, those services you have some kind of login, protecting that login and protecting your administrators for those services from getting phished. Also for things like financial accounts, things like business email compromise are relatively big, where somebody pretends to be the CEO, sends an email to the CFO or whoever your biz dev person is to release funds, right? And so that's one of the ways that people can actually steal your money. The second thing that you need to look at is just turning on automatic updates for key applications, web browsers being a big one. Most modern web browsers today will do automatic updating they've done that for years and years and years. Just turn it on, leave it on. It's usually turned on by default, but that gives you updates on that. And then for your operating system, so it doesn't matter what operating system it is, they all support automatic updates. And I'm talking about desktop users. Okay. For servers, obviously, you want to take a little bit more structured approach to that. The third thing is back up your desktops. So where you have data that's on your desktop, back that up, because as a small business, the impact of a ransomware or somebody leaving their laptop someplace or somebody getting their laptop stolen, the impact to the business is extremely high. Where maybe in a larger enterprise environment, losing one user's data isn't that big of a deal. And so what you should do is look at things. Number one, attach devices like USB drives. You can set up a lot of those to take backups. And both Microsoft and Apple have software that does that for you automatically whenever either it's a network drive, you connect to the network and it backs up, or you connect to your docking station or just a USB hub at the office, and it backs up over USB. Okay. And there are other options that are out there. Datto is something that I've been looking at where you do an automatic cloud backup. I think that's an interesting space that needs a lot more development, where you back up that device to the cloud, and then when you have to restore onto new hardware, you just pull it out of the cloud. Also with backup, I'll skip ahead one point here, which is if you're building software, always save any kind of changes to a revision control system. So either that's Git or all of the different revision control systems that people use, but having developers that at least they take the main software, build a branch, make their changes to it, and then push that branch back onto the revision control system. The fourth thing that I have here is just malware protection. Honestly, you get that a lot of times with the operating system. Sometimes you want to add on stuff, and just turn it on, leave it on, and add automatic updates. And then the last point on here, which is testing in production environments. So don't doing testing in production, have a subsystem where you can actually test. This only applies if you're building software, but you need this not necessarily as a security feature, but more as a stability feature. Once you have a development and a testing environment, you can go in and do some of the application security pieces just to test the application before you deploy it into production. Then as your company grows, you're looking at getting a security assessment. So having an external somebody come in, look at your security program, look at the things that you have built, and identify gaps and help you build a plan to add some kind of process or technology or people to fill that gap. Then about this stage, you'll look at hiring a security engineer to help you with whatever your product is, assuming you're on the IT side. If you're not building an IT product, then maybe it's something you want to delay until the next stage. The third thing is having a centralized patch management. So building a patch management server for all of your desktops and laptops to report into. So that way you can make sure that every device gets the full updates that it needs. The fourth thing I have on here is having an antivirus manager of some kind to receive alerts. So that way you can tell, it's just central management, right? So just like we're centralizing our patch management, now we're centralizing our antivirus or anti-malware support. And then the last thing that I have here is security tools for developers, where maybe this comes along with the product security engineer, but something that's integrated into your developers' IDEs or however their tooling is, in order to identify vulnerabilities and kick it back to them so that way they can fix things and write more secure code. And then the last stage for really what's a startup, and what you're looking at there is hiring a security manager, either full-time because there's just enough demand for them, or a part-time CISO, so a virtual CISO, which is what I do. The second thing, you're looking at hiring a security operations center. Probably not big enough to have your own, so you're looking at something like a managed security service provider in order to manage your patch management, your firewalls, your IDS, all of the other stuff that you've built over time. The third thing you're looking at is a product security program that's more formal. Instead of just hiring a security engineer and having them run everything, you're looking at a lot more things like training for developers, integrated tools. Maybe you're doing CI/CD, so continuous improvement, continuous deployment. Looking at tools to help support that, and a security component that comes along with that. The fourth thing is some kind of vulnerability management program. Maybe people at this time will start looking at a bug bounty program where you give rewards to people who bring problems with your production environment to you. And then as part of security operations and doing things and having people that respond to security incidents, you'll probably want them to join some kind of trust community, which is where incident responders get together and talk about issues that they're seeing. So that way they get smarter over time because they learn from other people's experiences. Now, having said all that, there are several instances where either because of regulation, because of customers' demand, because of other things, where maybe you need to build a security program before you normally would. And this is a list of all of these. So the first one is customer contract terms and conditions, where your customer, when you enter into a contract with them, requires you to have a security program, or they might specify particular regulations, requirements. They might say a holistic program, but they require you to create some kind of a security program. The second thing is getting acquired. So where you have a potential acquirer who comes along, they look at you as a company and they do due diligence on your company before they buy it. And they say, well, you don't have a security program, or in order to bring your company into our standard for security program, because they already have one, we need you to do these things. And they just take that as a mental note. And then once they acquire your company, then they'll bring that security program along with it. Part of funding rounds or VC input, it's very valid for VCs to realize that in order for you to exit, you need some kind of funding, and this should be part of what they fund, but you need to have a security program in order to reduce the exposure of incidents and increase your value to an acquirer. And then the last one is compliance regulations. They usually follow either a particular industry, so for example, healthcare, critical infrastructure, or they follow a particular data type, such as privacy information, and there's a bunch of different laws about privacy, or something like PCI DSS, which is about credit card payments. Now, the implied thing with all of this is that if you're operating normally, you get to the point where one of these things happen and you need help, obviously get in touch with me and I can at least talk you through what you need to do. Now let's talk about your customer. They usually have a role. It's security manager of some kind. Usually we call it a chief information security officer, but it could be anything. It could be VP of InfoSec. It could be Joe, the network guy, who also has a security responsibility. And they're intimidating as a vendor. Okay? You're a vendor. You want to go sell to the customer. Customer shows up, and now they have all of these security requirements that their CISO made them put into all of their agreements, even though maybe it's not applicable to the scope of what you have. It's just a company policy that they add security requirements. Okay? that's relatively intimidating as a vendor. And so really you have to understand, what's the CISO trying to do, right? What is your customer trying to do? And really what they're trying to do is understand what risks their business unit is taking on when they engage you as a vendor. They're trying to understand what additional security controls have they added to you as a vendor. And they are trying to understand what things they can do with their security program to support their business unit as they take you on as a vendor. Now, I understand that's pretty complicated. I think the important thing there to understand is that the customer security people, their security team, are there to help your customer, their business, and they just want to know how you're actually managing your own risk and what it means to their company if they take you on as a vendor. Unfortunately, the by-the-book answer for how security teams deal with their vendors is to require a whole bunch of different things. And when you're a small startup, that's usually cost prohibitive. You can't do all these things. And you run into this problem where you would sell more if you had all of the things that your customers are asking for. But on the other hand, you can't build these things until you have income from your customers coming in. And so some of the things that customers will ask for, in fact, it's almost by the book if you talk to the vendor management or vendor compliance folks, is number one, that vendor must be compliant with our security policy. Okay? The reason that this doesn't work as a startup, or is really as any vendor, is that being compliant with the customer security policy only scales to one customer. And so if you have 30 different customers that have a requirement that you're compliant with their security policy, at some point they're going to contradict each other, in which case you just throw your hands up in frustration. So what you do is you try to set something that's a high benchmark that meets the vast majority of their requirements, and then maybe the one-offs you can negotiate, but you don't take a blanket statement that says you'll comply with all of the customer security policy. The second one is endless vendor questionnaires. So every company that I've talked to has some kind of self-assessment questionnaire for vendors. I've been through more of these than I could ever hope to explain. There's a tact for that, which is get a standard questionnaire, and I have some listed there, but have information that you turn around and push to the customer in order to head off them requiring that you fill out their questionnaire. Right? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't work, well, then you're stuck filling out a questionnaire. But the trick is you want to minimize the amount of work that you spend to answer these questionnaires. The third one that you'll see a lot is certification to a security standard. That gets kind of weird. And the reason that it gets weird is because usually you have two types of assessments or audits that you get. Well, three if you count audits. You have assessments, which is somebody comes in, looks at your security program, looks at your controls, says, yes, you do what you say you do. Audits, which usually follow a formal structure and process and are aligned with a particular standard. Okay. And you have certification, which is an audit or an assessment, plus the certifier incurs some kind of liability if it's found that you're not actually in compliance with what they certified you for. So they have to charge more for certification simply because they have to absorb the risk of some kind of litigation happening. So instead of certification, maybe you could agree to being assessed under a particular standard or a particular framework that is going to be a cheaper solution. It's going to be more satisfying to both you and the customer. And then the last thing that customers ask for is a right to audit. So to be able to come in and look at all your controls. Now, the reason that I put a big, huge caveat on this one is because as a vendor, you are allowing your customer a carte blanche reason to spend a lot of your money. Okay? And it's not that customers have a right to come in and inspect you, but say you have 50 customers and all 50 of those customers want to invoke their right to audit, you probably don't have enough staff to support all those audits. And so you have to go hire people. It takes time. It takes effort. You're pulling engineers off doing production, or development work. It really disrupts your business. So you want to be very selective about which customers you give the right to audit to, or to either limit the duration of an audit or limit the scope of an audit. Then out of all that, what's really safe to do to promise to your customers? The first one, having a holistic security requirement, and there are several standards that you can use. ISO 27001, 27002, which is from the International Standards Organization. HIPAA, which is a law governing healthcare data. Most of HIPAA is about data transfer, but there's also security and privacy sections in that law. And then there's HITECH Act, which comes after, which adds some additional things. PCI DSS, which covers credit card payments, very small in as far as controls, but it implies a lot of other activity that has to happen. And then CMMC, which is a capabilities maturity model for cybersecurity for vendors to the government or the U.S. government, or to vendors that supply services to the U.S. government. Most of these standards are going to be relatively high level. That's why I call them holistic. So have a security policy for each of these main subject areas, have some kind of component of a security program. That allows you to move around inside of that program based on risk, based on cost, based on your own maturity level as an organization. Then the second thing, self-assessments on a questionnaire. I talked about this briefly, but one of the ones that's out there is the BitSig. It's for financial services, use it a lot, but it's the questionnaire. It's a huge kind of heinous questionnaire. And there's a light version of it, which actually works really well. But if you fill that out once for every customer who asks, you can say, here, you know what? You want me to fill out your questionnaire, but I've got a BitSig. I would gladly give it to you today. That'll probably answer all the questions that you need answered. PCI DSS also has something called a self-assessment questionnaire, and you can go fill that out, and it will answer all of the questions that you would expect for a customer to ask when they perform due diligence, especially if you're a merchant, a payment processor, you're dealing with something involving credit card data or cardholder data. And then the last thing that you can do to help customers and yourself out is to agree to an assessment by a third party. Obviously, if you agree to it, you have to get it done. So you need to be very careful about what your milestones and what your timelines are. Now, a good example that people use is SSAE 16, SOC 2 Type 2. And what that is you make assertions. You say, here, I do these security controls. You have an assessor, they come in, they say, yes, you do all these controls. And then they issue a statement that says, yes, you do that. Now you can take that report and you can give it to all of your customers on a recurring basis, maybe even make it available inside of a services portal if you have that, but just something where they can get periodic updates so they know that you're continuing to get your assessment. And that in a nutshell is roughly what you need to do as a startup or small, medium-sized business when it comes to security. Key points to remember here are, number one, build for the size company that you have and keep an eye towards what do you need to add to get to the next step of growth. The next one is understanding when you're doing something, taking data, taking on a customer, taking on a new particular industry that has regulation attached to it. and being ready when you overshoot what your existing security program is capable of doing. And then the last one, which is having a process to help your sales teams, your customer service teams, to make your customers happy with their security requirements and keep that cost, that level of effort maintainable and the right size for you for whatever your income is at for that particular time. Now, having said all that, once again, my name is Michael Smith. My company is Rising Tide Cybersecurity Management. You've got my link there. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find my company page on LinkedIn. Thank you all and have a good day.